He was the most beloved child in America, generating millions with a single innocent smile. But Hollywood doesn't raise children, it consumes them. The moment he hit puberty, the industry threw him away like a broken prop. 7 years later, the boy who sold the perfect American family was pulled dead from a freezing South Dakota river. His reward for sacrificing his childhood was a mere $1,700. Police quickly dismissed it as a tragic drunk driving accident. But the asphalt at the edge of the fatal drop revealed a horrifying truth. There were absolutely no skid marks. He never hit the brakes. He didn't try to survive. This is the brutal reality of Bobby Buntrock, a boy who didn't just fall into the abyss. He chose it. The early 1960s in America is often remembered through a lens of sepia-tone nostalgia, a time of economic prosperity and immaculate suburban lawns. But beneath this veneer of domestic perfection lay a society vibrating with the existential terror of the Cold War. It was into this specific, carefully engineered cultural vacuum that the sitcom Hazel debuted in 1961, and with it, the tragic trajectory of Bobby Buntrock began. This was the height of the Cold War. The geopolitical landscape was a powder keg, and the threat of nuclear annihilation was not an abstract concept. It was a daily psychological reality. School children were drilled on how to hide under their wooden desks in the event of an atomic flash. Families built fallout shelters in their back gardens, stocking them with tinned goods and bottled water. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 would bring the world to the very brink of Armageddon. The adult population was navigating a world fraught with tension, political assassinations, and the looming specter of global destruction. In this climate of pervasive low-level dread, the American public sought sanctuary. They found it not in the churches or the community halls, but in the glowing rectangular box situated in the center of their living rooms. Television in the early 1960s evolved from a mere entertainment medium into a psychological sedative. The networks understood their mandate clearly. The American people did not want complex, challenging narratives that reflected the terrifying realities of the outside world. They wanted comfort. They wanted predictability. They wanted the reassurance that somewhere the American dream was still intact, functioning perfectly, and completely immune to the threats of the nuclear age. Enter the golden age of the American domestic sitcom. The television landscape became saturated with highly idealized, meticulously sanitized representations of family life. These programs operated in a hermetically sealed universe where the biggest crises were burnt roasts, misunderstood school assignments, or a neighbor's intrusive dog. There was no war, no poverty, no existential dread. At the end of 24 minutes, every conflict was resolved with a gentle moral lesson, a warm embrace, and a comforting swell of orchestral music. Based on a popular single-panel comic strip by Ted Key, to the program centered on the Baxter family, George, a successful corporate lawyer, his elegant wife Dorothy, and their live-in maid Hazel, played with formidable scene-stealing brilliance by the legendary stage actress Shirley Booth. Hazel was the true head of the household, a competent, fiercely loyal, and hilariously outspoken domestic worker who constantly outsmarted her wealthy employers to solve their problems. But the emotional anchor of the show, the character designed specifically to capture the maternal and paternal instincts of the viewing public, was the Baxter's young son, Harold. And to fill this crucial role, the casting directors found a child who possessed a rare, unmanufactured magnetism. Robert W. Buntrock, born in 1952 in Denver, Colorado. Bobby was not your typical hyper-polished Hollywood child actor. He did not possess the overly rehearsed robotic delivery of kids who had been pushed through the stage school grinder since infancy. He had an authenticity to him, with his slightly tousled hair, wide, expressive eyes, and a smile that seemed to contain equal parts innocent mischief and genuine warmth. Bobby Buntrock was the boy every father wanted to toss a baseball with, and the boy every mother wanted to protect. Hazel affectionately dubbed him Sport, a nickname that perfectly encapsulated his energetic all-American persona. From the moment Hazel hit the airwaves, it was an unmitigated triumph. The chemistry between the veteran Shirley Booth and the young Bobby Buntrock was lightning in a bottle. Booth, a consummate professional with a commanding presence, found a perfect, endearing foil in the naturalistic charm of the boy. Their on-screen relationship, the protective, loving housekeeper, and the earnest, curious child, became the beating heart of the series. For 5 years, from 1961 to 1966, Hazel consistently ranked among the most watched programs in the country, sweeping the Nielsen ratings and becoming a fixture in the weekly routine of millions. During this half-decade reign, the American public developed a profound parasocial relationship with Bobby Buntrock. They did not just watch him act, they felt as though they were watching him grow up. Every week he was invited into their homes. They saw him lose his baby teeth. They saw his features begin to mature. They watched him navigate the highly sanitized, scripted trials of television childhood. In an era characterized by frightening instability, Sport was a constant. He was a weekly reassurance that the innocence of youth was still safe and protected, at least within the boundaries of the Baxter household. The studio executives, the network brass, and the advertising agencies looked at Bobby and saw a gold mine. He was the perfect vehicle to sell breakfast cereals, toys, and the overarching concept of the happy American family. He was featured in promotional materials, his face plastered across magazines, his likeness used to merchandise the wholesome image of the show. To the viewers, his life appeared to be a fairy tale of unprecedented luck and glamour. He was a famous, beloved child, working alongside television royalty, living a life that millions of children across the country could only dream of. But television is an illusion, a magic trick constructed with lighting, makeup, and carefully tailored scripts. The warmth and security that emanated from the screen were entirely fictional. The reality of Bobby Buntrock's existence behind the camera was a stark, disturbing contrast to the idyllic life of Sport Baxter. The Baxter family home, a symbol of middle-class tranquility to millions of viewers, was actually a three-walled set constructed inside a cavernous, drafty soundstage at Columbia Studios. The comforting sunlight streaming through the artificial windows was generated by massive, blindingly bright tungsten arc lights. The floor was a treacherous grid of thick electrical cables, heavy Panavision cameras, and microphone booms. It was a loud, chaotic, and highly industrialized workspace. While the nation was laughing at his on-screen antics, Bobby was functioning as a highly stressed, overworked cog in a ruthless industrial machine. The Hollywood studio system of the 1960s was an environment of extreme pressure and relentless demands, and it made very few concessions for the psychological or emotional well-being of its child laborers. He was a child carrying the weight of a multi-million-dollar franchise on his small shoulders. His days were not spent riding bicycles, playing in the dirt, or learning how to socialize with his peers. His days were dictated by call sheets, lighting setups, aggressive rehearsal schedules, and the constant looming threat of displeasing the adults who controlled his destiny. A typical workday for the young actor began long before the sun rose. By 5:30 a.m., he was already seated in the makeup chair, having thick pancake foundation applied to his face to ensure his complexion registered perfectly on the era's color film stock. His hair was sprayed into rigid place. His wardrobe was meticulously pinned and adjusted. He was not permitted to run, sweat, or engage in any normal boyhood behavior that might ruin his pristine appearance before the cameras rolled. The tragedy of Bobby Buntrock is rooted in this fundamental duality. He was the most famous, seemingly cherished boy in America, yet he was navigating a system designed to exploit him entirely. He was providing comfort to a terrified nation while slowly being stripped of his own humanity. The mandatory educational requirements for child actors during this period were often treated as frustrating bureaucratic hurdles rather than a genuine commitment to a child's intellectual development. Set teachers, known as welfare workers, were employed, but the schooling was highly fragmented. Bobby received his education in disjointed 15-minute intervals, squeezed frantically between complex lighting setups and camera blocking. The moment the assistant director called for his presence, the textbooks were slammed shut. The production schedule was paramount. His primary education was not in mathematics or history, but in hitting his physical tape marks on the floor, finding his key light, and delivering dialogue with precise comedic timing. The story of the boy in the freezing South Dakota River does not begin on the bridge in 1974. It begins in the suffocating artificial sunshine of the Hollywood sound stages in 1961. It begins with the signing of contracts that viewed a human child as a depreciating asset. It begins with a society that was so desperate for the illusion of innocence that it was willing to consume the real innocence of a child to maintain the fantasy. Behind the glowing screen of the television set lay the brutal, unforgiving architecture of the 1960s Hollywood studio system. It was a machine exquisitely designed to extract maximum capital with minimum legal protection for its youngest laborers. Between the years of 1961 and 1966, the program Hazel was not merely a popular television show, it was a colossal, unstoppable industrial juggernaut. Produced by Screen Gems and heavily sponsored by the Ford Motor Company, the series was a masterclass in corporate synergy, commanding a vast captive audience that advertisers salivated over. At the very epicenter of this multi-million-dollar enterprise was Bobby Buntrock. To the American public, he was sport, the lovable, mischievous scamp. But to the executives sitting in the wood-paneled boardrooms of Los Angeles and New York, Bobby was not a boy. He was a highly efficient, rapidly depreciating asset, a vital component in a lucrative assembly line that manufactured domestic nostalgia and sold it at a premium. The executives analyzed Nielsen ratings, demographic breakdowns, and sponsor satisfaction reports. In those ledgers, Bobby's wide-eyed smile was simply a metric of profitability. As long as the boy delivered the required performance, the network maintained its dominant market share, and the automotive sponsors sold more vehicles. During this 5-year golden era, Bobby's childhood was systematically dismantled for mass consumption. While peers navigated schoolyards, Bobby stood under blinding studio lights, heavily coated in makeup, repeating dialogue written by men 3 times his age. The soundstage was an exhausting, windowless cavern where affection was entirely transactional. He learned early that his value was tied to compliance. A delay on set cost thousands of dollars, and the immense pressure to perform fell squarely on his young shoulders. He developed a hyper-awareness of adult moods. If he delivered his lines flawlessly on the first take, he received praise, applause, and the visible relief of a crew eager to finish their long shift. If he stumbled over a word, forgot a mark, or simply exhibited the natural fatigue of a prepubescent child, the atmosphere on the set would instantly chill. He understood that his mistakes equated to financial losses for the studio. This environment fundamentally warped his psychological development, teaching him that his worth as a human being was entirely conditional upon his utility to a corporate production schedule. Furthermore, his image was a powerful currency. Plastered across promotional tours and commercial tie-ins, he sold the very concept of the idyllic American family. He became public property. He was dispatched to press junkets, county fairs, and holiday parades. During these grueling promotional circuits, he was expected to maintain the persona of Sport Baxter without breaking character. Strangers felt entitled to touch his hair, pinch his cheeks, and demand his signature. The boundaries between his actual identity and the fictional character he portrayed were obliterated by the relentless demands of studio publicity departments. Though surrounded by producers and publicists, he was profoundly isolated among adults whose livelihoods depended entirely on his ability to keep the illusion alive. There were no other children in his daily orbit. His colleagues were hardened industry veterans, cynical crew members, and anxious executives. He lived in an adult world, shouldering adult responsibilities, yet he was denied the autonomy and respect afforded to the adults around him. One might reasonably assume that the financial compensation for this total sacrifice of youth would be staggering. To the modern observer, accustomed to the astronomical salaries and robust trust funds of contemporary child stars, it seems logical that a central figure in a top-rated, long-running network sitcom would be guaranteed financial security for life. This assumption, however, completely ignores the dark, predatory financial reality of mid-century Hollywood. The legal frameworks designed to protect child performers, such as California's Coogan Act, implemented after the silent film star Jackie Coogan discovered his parents had squandered his millions, were tragically flawed and easily manipulated during Bobby's era. The law theoretically required a portion of a child actor's earnings to be set aside in a blocked trust, but the loopholes were massive, and the enforcement was notoriously lax. The original iteration of the Coogan Law only mandated that 15% of gross earnings be preserved. This left 85% of a child's income entirely vulnerable. Furthermore, guardians and business managers could easily petition the courts to access even the blocked funds under the broad, vaguely defined pretext of living expenses. In the ecosystem of Hollywood, these expenses were frequently inflated to justify maintaining a lavish lifestyle. The purchase of luxury homes, expensive vehicles, and exclusive country club memberships were routinely rationalized in court as necessary expenditures to maintain the child star's public image and ensure their continued employability. Furthermore, the concept of residuals, the ongoing payments an actor receives when a program is rerun, was severely restricted or entirely non-existent for children working under standard contracts at the time. The lucrative syndication rights were tightly controlled by the production companies and the networks. Bobby Buntrock worked for a flat weekly rate, while Hazel generated millions of dollars in advertising revenue during its initial primetime run, and millions more as it was subsequently sold into global syndication. The boy whose face anchored the series saw absolutely none of those back-end profits. His labor was bought at a fixed, discounted price, while the corporate entities harvested the exponential financial rewards of his image in perpetuity. Bobby Buntrock was generating immense wealth, but he was not accumulating it. The money he earned, the physical manifestation of his stolen childhood, was funneled into the hands of guardians, managers, and agents. The hierarchy of a child star's family often dissolves into a toxic, inverted power dynamic. The child becomes the primary breadwinner, the economic engine that sustains the household, yet they possess absolutely no legal or financial autonomy. They are the boss who cannot drive a car, the millionaire who receives an allowance. The psychological burden of this dynamic is crushing. A 10-year-old boy is forced to internalize the terrifying reality that the financial stability of the adults around him relies entirely upon his ability to memorize lines and hit marks on a soundstage. He cannot afford to be sick. He cannot afford to quit. He cannot afford to simply be a child. The adult caretakers, whether well-intentioned but naive or actively opportunistic, become the gatekeepers to the wealth. In addition to guardians, a child star's income was steadily eroded by a parasitic entourage of industry professionals. Agents took their 10% commission off the top. Business managers charged hefty retainer fees. Publicists billed for orchestrating the very promotional tours that further exhausted the child. Union dues and heavy taxation further decimated the gross income. By the time the money trickled down through this complex network of deductions, commissions, and lifestyle maintenance costs, the net savings were often shockingly small. In Bobby's case, the specific financial maneuvers of his management and guardianship remained shrouded in the opacity of historical accounting. But the mathematical outcome of his career is a matter of tragic, undeniable record. After dedicating 5 of his most formative years to a television phenomenon, after starring in over 140 episodes of primetime television, and after serving as the adorable face of a corporate empire, Bobby Buntrock's financial harvest was an absolute insult. By the time he reached his 21st birthday, the age of legal emancipation, the vast fortune he had generated had evaporated. Many historians and industry reports suggest his bank account, the supposed reward for surrendering his youth to the cameras, contained a paltry sum of approximately $1,700. It was a financial strip mining of breathtaking audacity. He had been paid pennies on the dollar for his labor, and even those pennies had slipped through his fingers, swallowed by the exorbitant costs of representation, the lifestyle of maintaining a Hollywood facade, and the fundamentally predatory nature of the contracts he had been signed to as a minor. He had purchased the entertainment of a nation, and the price had been his entire net worth. A sum of $1,700 was the total objective valuation that the industry placed upon 5 years of exhaustive labor and the permanent forfeiture of a normal human development. It was an arithmetic of profound cruelty, but the theft of his finances was merely the prologue to a much more profound and devastating betrayal. The ultimate cruelty of the Hollywood machine was not that it took his money, it was that it fundamentally despised him for fulfilling the most basic, unavoidable function of human biology. It despised him for growing up. In 1966, the landscape of American television was shifting. Hazel had moved from NBC to CBS for its final season, and the ratings, while still respectable, were beginning to soften as the culture outside the studio walls grew increasingly volatile and complex. The wholesome, sanitized domestic comedies of the early 1960s were slowly losing their grip on an audience confronting the escalating realities of the Vietnam War and domestic civil rights struggles. The evening news broadcasts, anchored by men reporting on body counts and political unrest, were creating a stark, unavoidable contrast to the hermetically sealed, artificially cheerful world of the Baxter household. But the most significant crisis facing the production was not the shifting demographics or the encroaching darkness of the real world. It was the biological ticking clock inside their young star. Bobby Buntrock was entering adolescence. The inescapable realities of puberty began to assert themselves, acting as a corrosive agent upon the highly marketable illusion of Sport Baxter. The boyish, high-pitched voice that had delivered countless punchlines and endearing catchphrases began to crack and deepen into an unpredictable, resonant baritone, causing massive headaches for the sound engineers who tried desperately to equalize his audio to sound younger. The small, manageable frame shot up, his limbs lengthening into the awkward, uncoordinated geometry of a teenager. The soft, cherubic cheeks that the camera loved so much lost their baby fat, revealing the sharper, more defined angles of a young man. The wardrobe department struggled to conceal these physical changes, desperately employing looser clothing, horizontal stripes, and carefully blocked camera angles to mask his sudden growth spurts. But the biological reality could not be hidden indefinitely. The directors were forced to shoot him sitting down more frequently or position him further back in the frame to maintain the forced perspective of a small child. Despite these frantic, behind-the-scenes maneuvers, the artifice was failing. He was visibly outgrowing the very premise of the show, and his changing body was becoming a daily, undeniable liability to the network's bottom line. To a normal family, these changes are milestones of development, a cause for celebration as a child transitions into adulthood, marked by a growing sense of independence and maturity. To a Hollywood television studio, these changes are a catastrophic continuity error. The industry does not view puberty as a natural progression. It views it as a product spoiling on the shelf, an aggressive depreciation of a carefully cultivated asset. The entire economic value of a child star is predicated on their ability to remain frozen in a state of unthreatening, perpetual innocence. The network had invested millions of dollars in a specific, static image, constructing massive marketing campaigns, and securing lucrative sponsorships based entirely on the guarantee that Sport Baxter would remain small, cute, and emotionally uncomplicated. The audience wants to see the cute child they fell in love with. They do not want to be reminded of the relentless passage of time by watching that child battle acne, awkward growth spurts, and the complex emotional volatility of the teenage years. Writers found it increasingly difficult to craft believable scenarios for a young man that had originally been designed for a mischievous 8-year-old. The comedic dynamic between the protective, maternal maid and the vulnerable boy evaporated the moment the boy began to tower over the actress playing her. Scripts that once featured him needing help with simple childhood problems now felt absurd and patronizing when delivered by a teenager with a deepening voice. Bobby's natural human development was, in the cold, calculating eyes of the casting directors and network executives, an unforgivable breach of the unwritten contract. He was being silently penalized for doing exactly what human beings are biologically programmed to do. He was no longer the malleable, easily portable prop they required. He was becoming a man, and Hollywood had no script for a man who used to be sport. When Hazel was finally canceled in 1966, the safety net vanished. Bobby, now 14 years old, was released back into the wild. The assumption within the industry is often that a successful child star will seamlessly transition into teen idol status and then into adult roles, parlaying their early fame into a lifelong, lucrative career. This is a myth, a survivorship bias based on the rare exceptions like Jodie Foster or Kurt Russell, which entirely ignores the thousands of discarded youths left in the industry's wake. For the vast majority of child actors, the transition is a graveyard. The entertainment machine constantly demands fresh, undiscovered faces for its adolescent roles, not the recycled anchors of recently canceled sitcoms. A new cultural wave was also hitting Hollywood in the late 1960s. The studio system was collapsing, making way for gritty, realistic cinema and rebellious counterculture television. When Bobby attempted to secure new roles, the reception was chillingly different from the fawning adoration he had experienced just a year prior. He walked into audition rooms no longer as the golden boy of network television, but as a compromised asset burdened by a deeply uncool, sanitized past. The casting, direct, Orrs looked at him and saw a physical contradiction. He was too old and too tall to play the cute kid, but his face was too inextricably linked to the character of sport to be believable in grittier adolescent roles that demanded an edge he simply did not possess. He carried the heavy, unshakable baggage of his own immense fame into every reading. Every time he read a line, regardless of the character's intended tone or the emotional depth he attempted to project, the producers heard the ghost of the sitcom. The suspension of disbelief was impossible for them to maintain. They could not look past the Baxter family living room. The illusion was broken, and his prior success actively sabotaged his future prospects. He was heavily typecast, a prisoner of his own success, trapped by the viewing public's refusal to accept him as anyone else and the industry's refusal to let him try. The rejection was swift, absolute, and profoundly dehumanizing. The doors of the studios, the only homes he had really known for 5 years, were locked against him. The security guards who had once waved his car through the main gates with a smile now required strict appointments and official passes he no longer possessed. The phone, which used to ring incessantly with offers for promotional appearances, magazine cover shoots, and commercial tie-ins, went entirely silent. It was a sudden, violent excommunication from the only reality he understood. He had not been fired because he lacked talent, or because he was difficult to work with, or because he had committed any professional misconduct. He had been fired because his biology had betrayed the brand, a fact that left him with a deep internalized sense of physical defectiveness. This abrupt termination of his career triggered a psychological freefall. The cognitive dissonance was absolute. For his entire conscious life, he was told he was special, beloved, and essential to a multi-million-dollar enterprise, only to be discarded the moment his voice dropped an octave. There was no transition period provided by the network, no psychological counseling, and no exit strategy to help him adjust to civilian life. The adults who had managed his daily schedule, adjusted his wardrobe, and praised his every move simply packed up their equipment and moved on to the next production, transferring their transactional affection to the next viable child star. It is a psychological whiplash that few adults could survive with their sanity intact, let alone a teenager whose entire self-worth has been intrinsically tied to the external validation and approval of an audience that had suddenly decided to look away. Bobby Buntrock was suddenly unemployed, broke, and stripped of his identity. He had spent the years when normal children learn how to navigate the world, learning how to hit a tape mark on a studio floor. He possessed a highly specialized, entirely useless set of skills. He knew how to find his key light. He did not know how to find a sense of purpose outside of a sound stage. He knew how to cry on cue for a camera, but he lacked the fundamental social frameworks that other teenagers develop naturally through uninterrupted schooling, consistent peer interactions, and the slow necessary process of making low-stakes mistakes. When he attempted to integrate into a regular high school environment, he found himself completely alienated. He was not viewed as a normal classmate, but as a displaced celebrity, a walking relic of a television era that was already fading into syndicated reruns. The harsh, fluorescent lighting of the public school cafeteria offered none of the warmth of the tungsten studio rigs, the relentless inquiries from peers about his time on set, their mocking requests for him to perform his old catchphrases, and their inability to see him as anything other than a television character only reinforced the devastating fact that his peak achievements were already behind him. He was entirely disconnected from the typical teenage concerns of prom dates, athletics, and college applications. He was a veteran of the entertainment industry before he was old enough to drive, a retired superstar before he had finished high school. The strict minute-by-minute daily structure that had defined his existence for half a decade evaporated overnight, leaving him entirely unmoored in a terrifying expanse of free time. The silence of his new life was deafening, a crushing vacuum where the applause used to be, amplifying his profound sense of worthlessness. And into that terrifying echoing void crept the insidious creeping shadows of a profound depression, setting the stage for a desperate geographical escape that would ultimately seal his doom. To be violently severed from one's own identity before the human brain has even fully developed its capacity for complex adult reasoning is a psychological trauma of unimaginable proportions. When the studio gates slammed shut behind Bobby Buntrock in the late 1960s, he was not merely an unemployed teenager facing a difficult job market. He was an exile, banished from the only reality that had ever provided him with a sense of purpose, structure, and validation. The abrupt cessation of his career triggered a catastrophic existential crisis, plunging the former child star into a suffocating, inescapable swamp of clinical depression. For a child raised by a television network, the psychological impact of this sudden rejection was uniquely devastating. For the entirety of his conscious formative memory, Bobby's self-worth had been inextricably linked to his ability to perform a highly specific, fictionalized version of boyhood. He had been conditioned, much like a laboratory subject, to associate happiness and approval with the glare of the arc lights, the frantic energy of the sound stage, and the booming voice of a director calling action. When that external validation was suddenly and permanently withdrawn, it did not just leave a void. It created a violent, terrifying vacuum that threatened to collapse his entire fragile psyche inward. The transition from being the most beloved boy in America to an anonymous, discarded adolescent was a psychological whiplash that left him profoundly disoriented. He would wake up in the morning with the deeply ingrained instinctual expectation of a call sheet, of a wardrobe fitting, of a script waiting to be memorized. But the mornings were now centered by a deafening, terrifying silence. There were no makeup artists to powder his nose, no stand-ins to take his place under the hot lights while the camera was focused, and, most devastatingly, no audience to applaud his existence. He was forced to confront the reflection in the mirror, and the face staring back at him was a stranger. It was not the cute, cherubic sport Baxter, whose image was still generating millions of dollars in syndicated reruns across the globe. It was a gawky, rapidly changing teenager, plagued by the natural awkwardness of puberty, carrying the heavy, invisible burden of a massive, unwanted legacy. He was trapped in the agonizing purgatory of being a has-been before he was even old enough to cast a ballot or legally purchase a drink. This loss of identity was compounded by the horrific, suffocating phenomenon of public nostalgia. Even as the industry turned its back on him, deeming him too old and too awkward for the screen, the American public stubbornly refused to let go of the illusion. When Bobby walked down the street, attempted to buy groceries, or tried to integrate into a normal social setting, he was rarely engaged with as a human being. He was treated as a walking, breathing museum exhibit. Strangers would approach him, their eyes wide with recognition, expecting to see the mischievous 8-year-old they invited into their living rooms every Thursday evening, when they were met instead with a sullen, deeply depressed teenager whose voice had deepened and whose innocence he had been entirely commodified and spent. Their reactions often ranged from visible disappointment to intrusive, interrogative cruelty. "What happened to you?" they would ask, implicitly demanding an apology for the crime of growing up. He was forced to constantly witness the mourning of his own childhood by people who had never actually known him. He became a prisoner of his own face. He was unable to forge an authentic identity because the public insisted on interacting exclusively with a character he had outgrown. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the concept of mental health support, particularly for young men, and especially for discarded child stars, was virtually non-existent. There were no dedicated therapists employed by the studios to help child actors transition into normal lives. There were no support groups for adolescents suffering from the uniquely isolating trauma of premature fame. The prevailing cultural attitude towards emotional distress was one of rigid, stoic suppression. You were expected to pull yourself together, to move on, to be grateful for the opportunities you had been given, regardless of how thoroughly those opportunities had exploited you. For a young man like Bobby, drowning in a sea of unarticulated grief, profound isolation, and total loss of direction, there was no lifeline thrown. He was entirely unmoored, adrift in a society that possessed neither the vocabulary nor the inclination to understand his specific, devastating brand of pain. Bereft of professional guidance, utterly lacking in life skills outside the highly orchestrated environment of a television production, and desperate to silence the relentless, torturous screaming of his own mind, Bobby Buntrock sought out the only readily available anesthetic he could find. He turned to alcohol, This was not the celebratory social drinking of a typical young adult exploring their newfound independence. This was a dark, medicinal, and deeply desperate consumption. Alcohol provided a temporary chemical lobotomy. It dulled the sharp, agonizing edges of his reality. It lowered the volume on the incessant, mocking memories of his past glory, and it offered a fleeting, artificial warmth in a world that had suddenly turned incredibly cold. When he was intoxicated, he did not have to think about the $1,700 bank balance that represented the totality of his childhood labor. He did not have to worry about the auditions he was no longer invited to, or the casting directors who looked right through him. In the bottom of a glass, he found a temporary sanctuary from the crushing, unbearable weight of being Bobby Buntrock. But alcohol, as it always does for those using it to self-medicate profound psychological trauma, quickly transitioned from a warm blanket into a suffocating straitjacket. The hangovers brought with them a rebounding, amplified depression, a terror so absolute it required more alcohol just to reach a baseline of numbness. The descent was rapid and vicious. The boy who had once been the picture of wholesome American health was now trapped in the grim, repetitive cycle of substance dependency. His days lost their shape, blurring into a continuous, hazy attempt to escape his own consciousness. As the depression deepened and the reliance on alcohol became a central, undeniable fixture of his existence, the physical environment of Southern California began to feel increasingly intolerable. Los Angeles is a city built on the relentless worship of the new, the beautiful, and the successful. It is an industry town where your social worth is entirely dependent on your proximity to power and your current market value. For a fallen star, Los Angeles is not merely a city, it is a sprawling, sun-drenched taunt. Every billboard advertising a new television show featuring the latest fresh-faced child actor was a physical blow. Every glimpse of a studio lot from the freeway was a devastating reminder of the home from which he had been permanently exiled. The perpetual, unyielding sunshine of California felt mocking, completely at odds with the dark, freezing winter that had settled permanently into his soul. The proximity to the epicenter of his trauma became a psychological burden too heavy to bear. He needed to escape. He believed, with the desperate, flawed logic of a man in deep pain, that a geographical cure could heal a spiritual disease. He convinced himself that if he could just get far enough away from Hollywood, far enough away from the cameras and the executives and the smog-choked valleys of his youth, he might be able to outrun the ghost of Sport Baxter. This desperate urge for geographic obliteration led him to make a drastic, ultimately fatal decision. He packed his meager belongings, left the Californian coast behind, and relocated to the vast, uncompromising wilderness of Keystone, South Dakota. The move to South Dakota presented a jarring, absolute contrast between the world he knew and the world he chose. Keystone, located in the Black Hills region of South Dakota, an area characterized by its rugged, ancient geology, dense pine forests, and extreme, punishing weather patterns. It is a place of profound, almost intimidating natural beauty, but it is also a place of deep, profound isolation. It is a landscape that demands resilience, a place where the winters are long, dark, and brutally cold. For a young man born in Denver but raised entirely within the artificial, climate-controlled, hypersocial bubbles of Hollywood sound stages, moving to rural South Dakota was akin to relocating to another planet. Bobby did not move to South Dakota to find himself. He moved there to lose himself completely. He was seeking an environment so alien, so completely disconnected from the entertainment industry that no one would know his face and no one would ask him to smile on cue. But the tragedy of the geographical cure is that you bring your own mind with you. The demons that had haunted him in he shadow of the Hollywood sign did not require a warm climate to survive. They thrived equally well in the biting, sub-zero winds of the Midwest. Instead of providing a peaceful sanctuary for healing and reinvention, South Dakota rapidly transformed into a sprawling frozen prison for his shattered psyche. The sheer, overwhelming isolation of the environment acted as an amplifier for his internal torment. In Los Angeles, despite the cruelty of the industry, he was at least surrounded by the kinetic energy of a metropolis. In Keystone, the silence was absolute, vast, and terrifying. The endless empty plains and the dark, looming silhouettes of the Black Hills offered no distraction from the relentless, agonizing echo chamber of his own thoughts. During the harsh winter months, when the snow drifts piled high against the windows and the temperature plummeted to levels that could kill a man exposed to the elements, Bobby was trapped indoors, effectively subjected to a form of voluntary solitary confinement. The cabin fever exacerbated his depression, twisting his grief into a dark, paranoid despair. The physical cold of the South Dakota winter perfectly mirrored the emotional freezing over of his soul. He was a young man in his early 20s, an age that should be defined by exploration, romantic entanglements, and the exciting, chaotic process of building a future. Instead, he was living like a haunted hermit, pacing the floorboards of a rural exile, entirely consumed by the past. The contrast between his former life and his current reality was enough to fracture whatever fragile grip on sanity he had left. Just a few years prior, his days were meticulously scheduled down to the minute. He was surrounded by dozens of people whose sole job was to attend to him. Wardrobe mistresses adjusting his collar, makeup artists patting his forehead, directors guiding his every movement. He had lived in a world of constant, albeit artificial, physical and emotional contact. Now, he was engulfed in an ocean of loneliness so deep it was physically painful. He would sit in the dim, freezing silence, the only sound the howling of the wind against the timber, and he would vividly, agonizingly remember the precise smell of the studio lot, the specific warmth of the stage lights, the sound of the crew laughing at his jokes. The memories were not a comfort. They were a torture device. In the silence of Keystone, he was entirely consumed by memories of a reality that no longer existed. In this terrifying isolation, the reliance on alcohol escalated from a coping mechanism into a full-blown, life-threatening addiction. The bottles became his only companions, his only reliable source of warmth in the frozen wasteland. When he did venture out into the local community, seeking the dim, smoky refuge of local taverns, he quickly discovered the inescapable, cruel reality of his fame. Even in the remote corners of South Dakota, the reach of syndicated television was absolute. The locals recognized him. They didn't see a young man struggling with profound mental illness. They saw the kid from the television box. The very anonymity he had fled halfway across the country to achieve was denied to him. The well-meaning but intrusive conversations, the request to recount stories from the set of Hazel, the constant, inescapable reminders of his former identity, it all served to violently trigger his trauma. He was trapped in a funhouse mirror. Everywhere he looked, he saw a warped, distorted reflection of the child he could never be again. By early 1974, Buntrock was exhausted. The systemic pressures of his past, the realities of his stalled career and the deep isolation of a South Dakota winter converged. It pushed a 21-year-old man to the absolute edge of his endurance as April approached. The relentless, suffocating pressure of his isolated existence in South Dakota ultimately culminated on a freezing night in April 1974. The physical and psychologics, geography of that evening perfectly mirrored his internal devastation. The winter thaw had barely begun to loosen its grip on the Black Hills, leaving the landscape trapped in a bleak, liminal state between the dead of winter and the hesitant arrival of spring. The roads winding through the rugged terrain near Keystone were treacherous, unlit ribbons of asphalt slicing through a profound, ancient darkness. There were no street lamps to pierce the gloom, no ambient glow from a bustling metropolis to offer a false sense of security. There was only the narrow, desperate beam of headlights cutting through the freezing air, illuminating a path that offered no destination, only a continuous, exhausting journey away from a past that refused to be outrun. Bobby Buntrock, 21 years old but carrying the psychological wreckage of an old man, was behind the wheel. The blood in his veins was heavily diluted with alcohol, a chemical surrender to the insurmountable pain of his reality. The liquor was not a catalyst for reckless joy. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket pulled over a mind that could no longer bear the agonizing friction of conscious thought. As the vehicle tore through the rural darkness, the isolation of the cabin mirrored the absolute isolation of his soul. The rhythmic hum of the engine and the hypnotic passing of the center line provided a deceptive lullaby. He was navigating a route near Battle Creek, a waterway that carved its way through the unforgiving South Dakota earth. In the distance, swallowed by the night, lay an infrastructure project, a bridge under construction. This was not a finished, safe passage. It was a violent interruption of the road, a raw, jagged precipice where the tarmac simply ceased to exist, giving way to a terrifying vertical drop into the churning, icy waters below. In the context of a rural highway in the 1970s, warning signs and barricades were often rudimentary, easily obscured by the dark or ignored by a mind that had already detached from the physical world. The car hurtled toward this structural void with a frightening, unwavering momentum. When a driver faces a sudden, catastrophic drop, human instinct almost universally triggers a frantic slamming of the brakes. This desperate attempt to halt momentum leaves a physical signature, deep scorch marks on the asphalt. Yet as Bobby Buntrock's vehicle approached the jagged edge of the unfinished bridge over Battle Creek, the road remained chillingly unmarked. The car maintained its velocity, launching into the freezing void before violently striking the sub-zero waters below. The structural integrity of the cabin failed, and the icy water invaded. In the pitch-black darkness of the sinking vehicle, Buntrock's life ended. By sunrise, recovery teams discovered the shattered wreckage. As the authorities identified the lone occupant as the former child star, the routine rural tragedy took on a surreal weight. However, the official investigative process moved swiftly toward a neat resolution. Noting the presence of alcohol in his system and the hazardous construction zone, police finalized the report: a tragic accidental death caused by driving under the influence. The paperwork was filed and the case was closed, but the physical evidence left at the edge of the abyss painted a more disturbing picture. The absolute absence of skid marks birthed a lingering hypothesis that has haunted Hollywood history. Accident reconstruction experts note that even severely intoxicated drivers usually exhibit evasive reflexes before a fatal impact. The unbroken trajectory suggests to many historians that this was not a tragic miscalculation. Instead, it points toward a horrifying probability that a completely exhausted young man saw the dark, rushing water below and made a deliberate decision not to hit the brakes, seeking a final escape from a life he could no longer bear. The entertainment industry met the news of his death with a profound silence. There were no grand memorials. There were no retrospective documentaries. The studios continued to syndicate Hazel, broadcasting the cherubic face of Sport Baxter to new generations, preserving the lucrative illusion while the real boy faded into obscurity. We may never definitively know the precise thoughts that raced through Bobby Buntrock's mind in those final seconds. All absolute claims are impossible. However, his legacy remains a chilling cautionary tale. Bobby's story reveals the devastating price of fame at such a young age. It's the reality of an industrial system that exploits innocence to the fullest, but fails to prepare children for survival when they are no longer useful. Sometimes Hollywood's greatest tragedies don't end under the dazzling lights, but are buried in the icy silence of a still river.